By thanking the Institute of Cultural Diplomacy and its director, Mark C. Bonfried, and the Slovenian hosts for inviting me to this important conference, whose purpose is to issue a call for international responsibility to respond to mass atrocities. The ICD initiative on the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide under the chairmanship of the Prime Minister of Slovenia, Janez Janša, reflects a strong will to break out of the geopolitical deadlock which has, in so many instances, prevented international action and allowed the architects and perpetrators of mass murders to go unpunished. While the Syrian crisis provides the backdrop of this gathering, giving it immediacy and political urgency, where shall they sleep tonight, said the Prime Minister in his very powerful introductory words. While the Syrian crisis, as I say, provides this backdrop, there are many, all too many, recent examples of the failure of the so-called international community to prevent acts of genocide, whether in Cambodia, Rwanda, Darfur, and Bosnia-Herzegovina. Indeed, the Slovenes know very well the consequences of the wars in the former Yugoslavia, characterized by ethnic cleansing, mass killings, and rapes, are still being deeply felt in this region and beyond. The question is not about a lack of knowledge about such atrocities, but about how to ensure that they are not committed in the first place. In this talk, I will discuss some of the dilemmas, interests, and contradictions which help explain why it has become so difficult to develop preemptive instruments or enforcement mechanisms to deal with mass crimes in the international arena. I do not pretend to know how to solve a problem where political leaders and international bodies have failed, and I come from a country that has been spared the experience of mass atrocities. But an engagement with core questions involved here about human rights, the international order, geopolitics, history, sovereignty, military interventions, and colonial legacies is needed to find ways to act more responsibly as individual citizens and as members of a collective or global community towards those who are in danger of being victimized as a result of extreme systematic violence. In 2005 UN initiative on the responsibility to protect, which was rooted in the failure of the international community to stop the Rwandan genocide, has become a central instrument here. The notion that sovereignty is not a right, but a responsibility, is based on three principles. Firstly, that a state has a responsibility to protect its population from mass atrocities. Secondly, that the international community has a responsibility to assist the state to fulfill its primary responsibility. Thirdly, that if the state fails to protect its citizens from mass atrocities, the international community has the responsibility to intervene through coercive measures such as economic sanctions or military intervention as a last resort. The responsibility to protect is what has been termed an emerging, if contested, norm, and it is not coded in international law. When it comes to implementation, the instruments are embedded in existing UN Security Council mechanisms, such as mediation, economic sanctions, and war-making power in the case of the existence of any threat to peace, to breach of the peace or act of aggression, as it is put in Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter. Charter. Thus, the authority to use force or engage in military intervention rests solely with the UN Security Council and the General Assembly. And it is here that there is no consensus on how to interpret or enforce the norm provided for in this principle. The current deadlock in the Security Council on the Syrian crisis exposes the crux of the dilemma when humanitarian concerns clash with geopolitical interests. That the Syrian conflict is a civil war is not disputed. It may be argued that it has not reached genocidal levels in the sense of the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, which defines the crime as intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. But there is no doubt that the Assad regime is engaged in a war against various groups of its own people. The opposition has also been engaged in atrocities, but in view of the immense power disparities, it is not comparable to those perpetrated by government forces. As the experience of other civil wars in places such as El Salvador, Guatemala and Honduras show a strong authoritarian government in control of the army is usually responsible for the vast majority of mass crimes committed in civil wars. Yet, despite the violence, the Security Council has not been able to agree on an effective response. The efforts of Joint Special UN and League of Arab States representative for Syria, Lakhdar Brahimi, to explore a political solution to the crisis should not be discounted. But it is clear that Russia and China want to use the Syrian crisis to draw a line in the sand, to oppose international intervention on the grounds that it violates state sovereignty, and to decouple the notion of the responsibility to protect from regime change. To them, the West overstepped the UN-sponsored humanitarian mandate in Libya by using the responsibility to protect Norm to topple the Gaddafi regime. According to this reading, the principle of sovereignty is in the last instance more important than that of protecting populations. The attitudes of Russia and China have to be put within the context of their own foreign and domestic political agendas. In the case of Russia, the opposition to Islamic secession movements in the North Caucasus and Russia's political and strategic interests in Syria. Russia's policy is also consistent with its opposition to the 1999 military intervention in Kosovo, which was justified on humanitarian grounds. The Russians claimed to be respecting the sovereignty of a defunct Federal Republic of Yugoslavia and were also motivated by a desire to protect their historical relationship with the Serbs. Similarly, China's policy is under the influence of its own sovereignty concerns in the Syrian crisis, the need to stifle any secession or self-determination attempts in Tibet, a stance that was also present in its opposition to Western military intervention in the Balkans in the 1990s. In the case of the Kosovo crisis, the UN Security Council was very much aware of an impending humanitarian catastrophe, hence Chapter 7 powers were activated, actually with Russian and Chinese support in 1998, or a year before the war, on the grounds that the grave situation threatened regional stability. In the case of Syria, however, Russia and China have refused to grant any such authority and repeatedly vetoed resolutions that would have punished the Syrian government with economic sanctions for failing to carry out a peace plan. Yet, as recent events in Turkey and Lebanon demonstrate, there is no longer any doubt that the Syrian civil war is threatening regional stability. Hence, when compared to the situation in Kosovo, Chapter 7 powers should have been evoked. But as noted, Russia's and China's opposition reflects a stronger attachment to the principle of sovereignty based on the argument that the West misused its UN Security Council powers in Kosovo and in Libya. Needless to say, what all this shows is that norms such as humanitarian interventions or responsibility to protect cannot be divorced from great power politics. It does, of course, not only apply to Russia and China. The United States and other Western powers, like France and Britain, are also motivated by such considerations. While the US reluctantly took the lead in Bosnia and Kosovo, it has not been willing to commit itself to an intervention in Syria for various reasons. One may be traced to domestic politics, that the Obama administration will not take any foreign policy risks involving Syria before the US presidential election. Another related point is the question of selectivity. Why are some civil wars considered more important than others when the issue of intervention is considered? The failure to act in Rwanda is, of course, the most blatant example of double standards. Indeed, despite public commitments to ethical concerns about the responsibility to protect, state behavior is far more often driven by perceived national interest, power politics, or cynicism, often justified in the name of international law, that is, the principle of sovereignty. This is not to say that the state of sovereignty is an anachronism or a bad thing. On the contrary, it is one of the few weapons small states possess in their dealings with great powers and against colonial, neo-colonial, or imperialist policies. The Brazilian government, under the leadership of President Dilma Rousseff, has attempted to break the impasse between those states that insist on the inviolability of sovereignty and those that see the responsibility to protect as overriding sovereignty under certain circumstances. Brazil has made it clear that it is against any efforts to use responsibility to protect to further regime change, as was the case in Libya, where neo-colonialism, while being firmly in favor of upholding the norm itself against crimes against humanity and genocide. Instead, it has proposed a framework for sovereignty as responsibility, or what has been dubbed responsibility while protecting. Thus, Rousseff has introduced additions to the responsibility to protect doctrine designed to limit its misuse while keeping their founding principles intact. Brazil proposes that the authorization of force within the context of responsibility to protect must be limited in its legal, operational, and temporal elements, and that the mandate must be conferred by the Security Council or General Assembly. In addition, as it exercises its responsibility to protect, the international community itself must show a high level of responsibility. Both concepts should evolve together based on an agreed set of fundamental principles, parameters, and procedures. The proposal has been criticized on the grounds that since Brazil tends not to support intervention in the first place, it abstained on the Libyan intervention and has opposed several others. It fudges the issue of when this new responsibility should kick in, or when the United Nations should authorize force. It also leaves unclear what concrete difference this would make in places where intervention was being contemplated. Such criticism may be a bit unfair, since the original responsibility to protect document is not particularly clear on the timing of intervention. And it must be said that Brazil has not shirked from international responsibility and has been engaged in humanitarian efforts such as the United Nations-led mission to Haiti. What the Brazilian approach highlights is the need to move beyond the assumption that the only countries affected are the interveners and those that the intervention is directed at. There are often painful consequences of interventions that have aggravated existing conflicts, allowing armed conflict to emerge in places where it previously did not exist, and given rise to new cycles of violence and increased the vulnerability of civilian populations. The Iraq War comes to mind in this context, even if it was not justified on humanitarian grounds. In practical and ethical terms, the notion as expressed in the Brazilian proposal that responsibility to protect should not be used for purposes other than protecting civilians raises a host of questions. The counter-argument can be made that it serves the interests of the status quo by stabilizing and indirectly at least propping up governments that are responsible for mass atrocities. The experience of sending in United Nations peacekeepers to protect civilian populations into civil conflict, where governments and paramilitary forces are strong, has in some cases proved disastrous. In Srebrenica genocide, the Srebrenica genocide, which took place before the eyes of international peacekeepers, is a case in point. It can also be argued that the concept of sovereignty cannot be separated from another concept, that of legitimacy. Why should the sacrosanctity of sovereignty be accepted uncritically if government power has been usurped illegally or by violent and undemocratic means? Why should the international community condone the right of a government to terrorize its own population if it reflects the interests of a small minority or ethnic group bent on ruling and controlling the majority population through coercion? The Assad government, for example, has no universal popular mandate or legitimacy. Why should the United Nations make it a precondition for any intervention that this regime be kept in power? One can make the case that by doing so, the international community is sheltering war criminals. It has been suggested that the international stalemate can be broken by removing Assad from power while maintaining the state machinery dominated by the Alawis. Such a great power compromise would take into account the Western demand of dethroning the head of the regime and preserve Russian influence in the country. But it would also give legitimacy to an elite responsible for grave crimes and defeat the purpose of the responsibility to protect principle. The perpetrators would not only be able to stay in power, but get away with committing mass crimes. Brazil wants to adopt a middle position. While not aligning itself to the more interventionist states like the United States, France, Canada, and Britain, it does not support Russia's and China's hard non-interventionist stance. The rejection of any international intervention on sovereignty grounds is not consistent with the United Nations' emphasis on responsibility to protect. And it can be argued that it is untenable after the Rwandan genocide. But what the Brazilians have done is to try to focus more on the rules of engagement and on the terms of the implementation of responsibility to protect operations. In that sense, the initiative is useful, even if the ethical question on intervention cannot, in the end, be divorced from the political will and capabilities of great powers. If Western governments want to get broad support from United Nations member states for the adoption and implementation of normative principles, such as the responsibility to protect, to prevent genocide, they have to listen to such arguments. As I have discussed here, the imperative to protect populations has usually been tempered by such factors as the nature of the conflict, dominant paradigms in international politics, geographical settings, balance of power interests, historical relationship between states and domestic and national political agendas. Two questions are central here. The nature of the intervention and its timing. Experience shows that the protection of the lives of the interveners is sometimes considered more important than those selected for protection. The Kosovo War is a case in point. By its exclusive use of airstrikes and ruling out a ground offensive, NATO gave primacy to the protection of Western lives rather than the lives of others. Such a risk-free, high-tech military intervention was ethically problematic because it called into question its publicly stated purist motives and because it allowed continued ethnic cleansing to take place on the ground or before Slobodan Milosevic decided to remove Serbian military forces from Kosovo. This points to the human cost of operations justified for humanitarian or responsibility to protect reasons. To be sure, the Kosovo Albanians supported Western intervention, for it gave them the hope of seeing an end to Serbian repression. But the human sacrifice was high and should not be discounted. The timing of an intervention is no less problematic. When has a threshold been overstepped that justifies sanctions or military interventions to protect populations? Is it too early or is it too late? As experience shows, it never boils down to a humanitarian norm alone. Decisions to respond to state-sponsored atrocities, as was the case in Bosnia and Sierra Leone at a later stage, have often been made when the United Nations Security Council has failed. In retrospect, such interventions stopped wars and killings and laid the groundwork for a lasting, if fragile, peace. In the Syrian case, there are other predominant factors at work. Syria's ethnic diversity, population density, loyalty to the military, weakness of the opposition, lack of real Arab League support, and Russia's support for Assad, all of these factors have deterred the United States and other Western countries to act with or without the UN mandate. Such a geopolitical impasse favors inaction, and in such situations the question usually arises whether political leaders are considered part of the problem or the solution. Milosevic occupied both roles, first as the facilitator and signatory to the Dayton Accords, putting an end to the Bosnian civil war, and later as the troublemaker and sponsor of ethnic cleansing in Kosovo. Despite a strong will by the Western powers to get rid of Assad, the jury is still out on his role in ending the crisis. One other possibility is military backing based on geopolitical interest, or proxy wars, as it was called during the Cold War, when one side arms the opposition and the other the government. In practice, strict humanitarian concerns are thus relegated to a second-tier status, even if arguments can be made for arming a population facing mass atrocities if there is no external willingness to intervene to stop them. Again, the Syrian conflict can take on such a function if the great powers fail to break the impasse. To sum up, despite the emergence of international norms such as the concepts of humanitarian intervention and the responsibility to protect, geopolitical and national interests have always conflicted with their meaning and use. Hence, it is doubtful that a single, clearly defined mechanism with universal applicability can be found for dealing in a preemptive way with impending crimes against humanity or genocide. That does not mean that the international community should accept the current failure of the UN Security Council or assume that inaction or passivity in the face of mass crime should be tolerated. Our discussion at this conference must take into account various approaches to political action geared towards the upholding of the principles of the responsibility to protect. This includes ways to codify the norm in international law. It will not resolve the tension between human rights and sovereignty principles. Yet any step in this direction would buttress the legitimacy of international law. Paradoxically, we also need to take into account the possibility of excusable breach in the case of a lack of UN Security Council consensus on intervention, if urgent political and moral reasons, such as an impending genocide, call for it. This requires a clearer definition of situations where populations face mass atrocities. This will be very difficult because each conflict has different dynamics depending on its nature, geography, proximity to and interests of other stakeholding countries. Moreover, the history of interventions for humanitarian purposes has been decidedly mixed. Such scenarios have, therefore, to be traced with extreme care, treated with extreme care, because they could undermine existing international legal codes protecting civilian populations. Nonetheless, such questions can be evaded, for they are existential for those affected, the victims. As the French sociologist and philosopher Jean Baudrillard put it, forgetting the extermination is part of the extermination itself, because it is also the extermination of memory, it's the extermination of history. The same applies to the vulnerable populations in crime situations. By forgetting them, the international community becomes complicit in crimes against them. Thank you.